The year is around 900 BCE. Dawn breaks on the northeastern coast of Kyushu. Smoke curls from pit house chimneys. Dogs bark at the surf, and the Jomon village stirs to life. These people have lived here for generations. Fishers, foragers, potters. Their world has been stable for thousands of years, with shell middens rising like archives of meals gone by. But this morning, as the tide glints off irrigation ditches just beyond the bay, the villagers see something new. Fields. Rectangles of standing rice, tended by strangers. This is where the story begins, not with fire and battle, but with an intrusion that looks deceptively peaceful. Rice. The Jomon had thrived as fisher-hunters for millennia, shaping one of the world's longest continuous foraging cultures. Junko Habu's landmark book, Ancient Jomon of Japan 2004, calls them sedentary foragers, settled yet mobile, balancing nuts, fish, and wild game in an economy that endured 10,000 years. Archaeologist Mark Hudson, writing in Antiquity in 1999, described them as a culture of continuity and innovation, remarkably stable but never stagnant. Their pottery is among the oldest in the world, their ritual figurines, dogū, haunting, almost modern in their abstraction. And yet all of this longevity carried a hidden vulnerability. When rice crossed the sea, it carried with it something the Jomon had never faced before: exponential growth. Archaeologist Simon Kainer has argued that rice was more than a crop. It was a social technology, one that locked people to the land, multiple households, and reshaped entire landscapes into grids of wet fields and dikes. The villagers in the Kyushu shore weren't staring at a harvest, they were staring at a demographical tidal wave. For the first time, the Jomon were not alone, and for the first time, their survival depended not only on the forest, the sea, or the seasons, but on how they faced the people who had come to stay. Before rice, before iron, before the strangers on the shores of Kyushu, there was the Jomon world. A culture so enduring it lasted longer than the Egyptian pharaohs, the Maya, and the Roman Empire combined. 10,000 years of continuity, and then almost nothing. Archaeologist Junko Habu, in her 2004 book Ancient Jomon of Japan, describes the Jomon as sedentary foragers. They lived in pit dwellings clustered near rivers and coasts, surviving not on a single staple but on a diversity: chestnuts and acorns, salmon runs, shellfish, deer, boar. Mark Hudson, writing in Antiquity in 1999, called this balance continuity and innovation. Their society adapted again and again, but without abandoning its core. They may not have farmed, but they were never primitive. Their pottery tells the story best. The earliest Jomon ceramics, dated to around 16,000 years ago, are the oldest known in the world. In 1991, Hudson and Barnes emphasized how advanced they were in ritual as well. The small clay figurines known as dogū, abstract, wide-eyed, almost alien, speak of symbolic worlds we can only guess at. These are so famous around Japan that it transpired into pop culture that spread worldwide. You can easily spot their shapes in Dragon Quest, Okami, or even Pokemon. Yes, Baltoy and its evolution, Clay Doll, are literally the representation of a dogū. But dogūs aren't the only cultural items the Jomon left us. In shell middens, archaeologists find beads carved from bone, lacquered ornaments, and polished stone tools. This was a people with art, memory, and ritual stretching across millennia. Yet longevity can be a trap. Habu argues that the Jomon economy was rich but limited. It was most probably capped by their way of life. Stable populations sustained by seasonal harvests, but unable to explode in numbers. So, when rice arrived from the continent, it wasn't just a new food source, it was an entirely different demographic regime. In 2022, Kremer and colleagues demonstrated how rice agriculture created much more rapid population expansion wherever it spread in prehistoric Japan. In contrast, Jomon's subsistence was slow breeding, dependent on the rhythms of ecology. They never created any food surplus to rely on, when farmers could withstand harder times with plenty of grain. They never created any food surplus to rely on, when rice farmers could withstand harder times with plenty of grain. And when 10,000 years of stillness met the mathematics of exponential growth, it was only a matter of time before the Jomon were no longer the masters of their own islands. And that tipping point happened somewhere between 900 and 300 BCE. When the Yayoi crossed from the Korean peninsula into the Kyushu, they didn't just bring rice. They carried an entire package of technologies that was unheard of to the Jomons. Shinya Fujio, in his synthesis The Yayoi Culture 2021, noted that bronze bells and weapons appeared in ritual context, marking prestige and power, but it really was iron that made the difference on the ground. Iron axes cut forests the Jomon had managed for millennia. Iron sickles harvested rice faster than stone blades ever could. Iron-tipped spears and arrowheads greatly improved hunting. But it also shifted the balance of violence. In a clash, stone shattered, iron endured. The new arrivals also reshaped the very landscape. Archaeologists have uncovered moated settlements across the northern Kyushu dating to the Yayoi horizon. These were not the scattered hamlets of Jomon fisher hunters, but defended villages, laid out with ditches, palisades, and communal storage pits. In 2013, Mizoguchi called them fortified nodes of agricultural life. Spaces that protected grain, livestock and families, while also projecting dominance over their neighbours. And behind these walls was a new kind of society. In Jomon villages, burials and houses often showed little signs of hierarchy, as displayed in other hunter-gatherer societies. Throughout the world, by contrast, Yayoi cemeteries reveal inequality, some graves rich with bronze mirrors and weapons, others bare. Yayoi, like most other farming societies, had a stratification system that also went with the regular package of inequality. This wasn't just a different economy, it was a different way of organizing power, hierarchical, martial, and most probably expansionist. To the Jomon, the change would have been impossible to miss. Alongside their pit dwellings and shell myriads now rose moated villages, stockpiled surpluses, and iron weapons. It wasn't just a matter of more mouths to feed, it was a matter of who controlled the land, the tools, and the violence. The Yayoi package, rice, iron, fortified villages, land ownership, inheritance, it all wasn't just a recipe for growth. It was the perfect guide to conflict, and their culture left more than fields and villages behind. It left bodies. Archaeologists have also uncovered signs that conflict shaped daily life itself. Burials from the Yayoi horizon often include not just tools, but iron-tipped arrows and spears deliberately interred with the dead. Kofun cemeteries in northern Kyushu sometimes contain entire families, suggesting sudden deaths, not gradual attrition. And in several regions, settlement layers show villages abruptly abandoned, their houses burned or dismantled, as if communities had been driven out overnight. The skeletons tell the rest. In 1990, Mark Hudson described how burials from the Yayoi period show a sharp increase in trauma. Arrowheads embedded in ribs, skulls fractured by blunt force, bones slashed by blades. In the Cambridge World History of Violence, published in 2020, John Padgett highlighted middle Yayoi cemeteries where up to 50% of the adult remains carry signs of violence. Such proportions could only mean one thing: these weren't isolated murders, they were massacres. And coincidentally, they cluster where resources mattered most. Grain was not just food, it represented survival, prestige, even political capital. Villages that could stockpile rice became targets. Raiding was inevitable. Between Jomon and Yayoi, but very likely in between Yayoi settlements themselves. But in these contests, the Jomon stood at a fatal disadvantage anyway. One skeleton from the Doigahama site in Yamaguchi shows a clear and chilling example. A man buried with an iron-tipped arrow still lodged in his spine. The shaft had long decayed, but the arrowhead sat between the vertebrae, proof of a shot that struck from behind and killed him instantly. The Doigahama was not unique. At the Tsukumu shell mound in Okayama Prefecture, archaeologists uncovered more than 100 burials, many showing projectile injuries. Some skeletons carry multiple arrow wounds, including a young woman with 2 points still embedded in her ribs. Others were found piled together, suggesting not individual killings, but raids that ended in massacre. Even earlier Jomon contexts hint at rising conflict as the Yayoi frontier closed in. At the Yoshigo site in Aichi Prefecture, several burials show cranial fractures consist with blunt force trauma, including children. The same, Hudson argued, that these patterns suggest whole communities were attacked, not just warriors on a battlefield. Taken together, these remains reveal a landscape where violence was not an exception, but an expectation. Some individuals died with weapons still lodged in their bones, others were buried in hurried mass graves. And beneath it all lies the same imbalance. Communities armed with iron, fortified in moated villages, striking against neighbours whose tools broke on impact. This wasn't the end of the Jomon, not yet, but the message was written into their bones. The balance of violence had shifted. Where stone once sufficed, only iron could decide who lived and who disappeared. And this is where genetics can enlighten us a little bit on the events, because archaeology shows us the wounds, but genetics can show us the scale. For decades, Japanese prehistory was framed by what anthropologist Kazuro Hanihara in 1991 called the dual structural model, the idea that the modern Japanese descended from two main sources, the Jomon foragers that were there first and the Yayoi farmers who replaced them later on. But the latest wave of ancient DNA has made that picture even starker and stranger. In 2021, Nicholas Cook and colleagues published in Science Advances a study sequencing genomes from across Japan's prehistoric timeline. Their results detonated like a bomb in the field. The modern Japanese are not just a blend of Jomon and Yayoi, they carry a third ancestry as well, tied to migrants who arrived during what's called the Kofun period. And as I'm pretty sure you know as much as me about the Kofun period, before I made the researches for this video, here's a little recap. The Kofun period, which lasted roughly from 250 to 538 CE, gets its name from the giant tombs that still rise out of the Japanese landscape. If you've ever seen them from above, they look like massive keyholes carved into the earth, some of them longer than 4 football fields. These weren't just graves, they were statements of power, ringed with moats and packed with terracotta guardians called haniwa, little clay figures of warriors, dancers, even animals, lined up to watch over the dead. If you see my video about the Yamnayas, this should remind you of the Kurgan burials, which are actually the same thing, but spanning across Europe, from a different culture and usually of a smaller size. But still, I couldn't shake the similarity out of my head. But back to our Kofun period. This is the era when Japan stopped being just a patchwork of villages and started to look like an early state. Elites ruled from fortified centres, farmers worked ever larger fields, and horses, with imported gear from Korea, turned warfare into something faster and deadlier. Gina Barnes, an archaeologist who's written extensively on the period, calls it the moment of state formation. Even Chinese chronicles start to mention Japan at this point, describing it as the land of Wa, a place sending envoys across the sea. In short, the Kofun weren't just about giant tombs, they were about a whole new order, kings on top, warriors on horseback, and the beginnings of Japan as something more than just a collection of islands. I'm not going to redo my whole speech on the warrior class-based societies, you pretty much know it by now. So now I've summed up the Kofun period, you started to get the overall idea. The Japanese archipelago was remade 3 times, first by hunter-foragers, then by rice farmers, and finally by state-building elites. And the first Jōmon contribution is almost entirely gone by now. On the main islands of Honshu, Kyushu, Shikoku, Jomon ancestry survives at only 6 to 19%, with an average standing at 12.5%. All the rest was replaced. In a 2024 Nature Communications paper, Masahi Yamamoto and his team broke it down even further. Populations in central Japan carry under 10% Jomon ancestry, while Hokkaido and the Rikoko Islands preserve far more. What used to be 100% Jomon is now a faint trace, a survival rate of less than 1 in 5. Even more revealing are the sex-specific lineages. Y chromosomes studied show sharp breaks in paternal ancestry, suggesting Jomon male lines were disproportionately lost, while mitochondrial DNA passed from mothers shows more continuity. Jomon weren't just erased cleanly, as many other forager societies before them. They were absorbed asymmetrically. Their women folded into the bloodlines of farmers and elites, while their men vanished from the genetic record. And these genetics don't just confirm the Jomon were replaced. They show who came next. To understand that third ancestry, we need to step into the world of the Kofun. By the 3rd century CE, the old balance was gone. The Jomon were reduced to the margins and the Yayoi had filled the fields, and something new rose at the centre, colossal tombs carved into the earth in the shape of a keyhole. The Kofun period takes its name from these tombs, built between 250 and 538 CE. Some stretched over 400 meters long, ringed with moats, filled with grave goods and lined with haniwa, clay figures of warriors, dancers, even animals, set out like silent guardians. From the air, they looked like symbols etched into the land, proclaiming who ruled here and who would be remembered. Inside, archaeologists find signs of a society transformed. The grave goods tell of new hierarchies, bronze mirrors, iron armor, horse trappings, objects tied to power and status, not subsistence. Gina Barnes in State Formation in Japan 2007 calls this the archaeology of kingship, a society no longer organized by villages but by elites at the top of a pyramidal order. For the first time, Japan was something closer to a state. Contacts across the sea deepened the transformation. The Kofun elites drew technologies from the Korean peninsula, advanced ironworking, horse gear, and weapons that turned warfare into something faster and more decisive. By the 5th century, Chinese chronicles described the emissaries from the land of Wa, proof that these tomb builders weren't just local chiefs anymore. They were kings making themselves known abroad. And here's the irony. For all the scale of their tombs, we actually know less about the Kofun elites than about the Jomon foragers who lived 10,000 years earlier. Why? Because the largest Kofun, those linked to Japan's imperial line, are still sealed by the Imperial Household Agency. Excavations are banned. The bones and artifacts inside remain untouched, guarded as sacred. The result is a strange silence. We can see the tombs, measure their moats, and map their keyholes from satellites. But the people who ruled inside them, their very ancestors who forged Japan's first state, are still mysteries. Their secrets buried just meters beneath our feet. Yet, while the Kofun elites built monuments the size of mountains, the real Jomon legacy wasn't buried in keyhole tombs. It survived in the margins, in people the state tried for centuries to erase. In the north and south of Japan, the Jomon legacy remains far stronger than on the mainland. While we stated that the average Jomon ancestry across Japan is about 12.5%, populations in Hokkaido are preserving nearly 30%, the highest anywhere in the archipelago. Among the Ainu, this legacy is clearest. Their genomes carry maternal lineages directly tied to Jomon ancestors, a continuity first highlighted by Noriko Adachi's 2011 mitochondrial DNA research. And far to the south, the Ryukyu Islands also show elevated Jomon ancestry. Isolated by sea, their populations retained both genetic traces and cultural echoes, distinctive pottery, subsistence traditions, and ritual practices that diverged from the mainland's Yayoi Kofun trajectory. Archaeologist Mark Hudson has described the Ainu and Ryukyuans as peripheral continuities, living archives of a foraging past erased elsewhere. But survival came at a cost. For the Ainu, life under mainland Japanese rule meant systematic oppression. From the 15th century, the Matsumae clan was given exclusive control of trade with Ainu. In practice, this meant monopolies, forced barter, and exploitive contracts that stripped the Ainu of economic independence. By the 17th century, Ainu were compelled to provide labour for Japanese merchants, often under brutal conditions. Resistance sparked uprisings, most famously Shakyushin's revolt of 1669, when Ainu groups united to fight against Matsumae dominance. The rebellion was crushed, its leaders executed, and Ainu autonomy extinguished. Later revolts like the Menashi-Kanushiya Rebellion of 1879 ended the same way, in blood and repression. When the Meiji state absorbed Hokkaido in the late 19th century, persecution took on the language of modernization. The 1899 Hokkaido Former Aborigines Protection Act stripped Ainu of their land, forcing them into small plots unsustainable for farming. Hunting and salmon fishing, central to their culture, were criminalized. Ainu children were sent to Japanese schools where their language was banned, their names replaced, and their rituals dismissed as superstition. Traditional tattooing practices for women were outlawed. For decades, Ainu became a slur used to justify poverty and exclusion. This should probably remind you of the treatment that the Native Americans have been subjected to by the US government at the exact same period. This was in line with the Japanese colonial policy of the Meiji era at the time. By wanting to emerge as a new superpower of the Asian continent, Japan adopted Occidental models, but full speed, industrialization, colonization, militarism, all at full throttle, only to meet its end at the end of World War II. But Japan never really did the acknowledgement work other nations have done, like Germany, France, the UK, or even the US. Only in 2008 did the Japanese government officially recognize the Ainu as an indigenous people, after centuries of denial. In the Ryukyu Islands, the pattern was different, but no less violent. The Ryukyu kingdom had its own kings, language and diplomacy with China for centuries. But in 1609, the Satsuma domain invaded and forced the kingdom into subordination. Tribute was demanded in two directions, to Japan and to China. The Ryukyu was kept at a cultural middle ground, its independence hollowed out. In 1879, the Meiji government abolished the kingdom outright, renaming it Okinawa Prefecture. Land reforms dispossessed local communities. The Ryukyuan language was suppressed in schools, with children forced to wear dialect tags as punishment if they spoke their mother tongue. Cultural identity was recast as backwardness, just as with the Ainu. And in the 20th century, Okinawa became the front line of war. In 1945, the Battle of Okinawa killed up to a third of the civilian population. Survivors were forced into US bases or left under military rule for decades. Even today, Okinawa carries a disproportionate burden of US military presence, another form of occupation layered on older histories of Eurasia. So yes, Jomon ancestry survived strongest in Hokkaido and Okinawa, but the people who carried it paid the price of survival in subjugation. Genetic continuity was paired with political persecution. The edges of Japan kept the Jomon alive, but only in bloodlines marked by centuries of dispossession. But the persecutions weren't the only cost, because the truth is the Jomon weren't wiped out in a single battle. Their disappearance was slower, quieter, and extermination without a massacre. Generation after generation, agriculture, demography, raids, microbial shock, all these participated over a long span of time to thin out the Jomons to the point where they are now, a minority into what used to be their country. "10,000 years of Jomon life ended not with a single catastrophe, but with silence. Their villages were abandoned, their lines folded into others, their voices drowned in the language of farmers and kings. And yet, for all the ways they vanished, they remain the clearest people of Japan's deep past. Their pottery, their bones, even their DNA speaks to us in detail. And here's the paradox. The same can't be said for the Kofun elites who followed. Their monuments were vast, mounds larger than pyramids, moats still tracing the land like scars. But their stories are sealed. The Imperial Household Agency forbids excavation of the Great Kofun, guarding them as sacred tombstones. No scholar can enter, no bones can be studied, no artifacts can be named. The people who built Japan's first state are still hidden, their secrets buried just meters below the grass. It's a strange reversal. We know more about a Jomon fisherman who lived 10,000 years ago than we do about the kings who ruled 1,500 years ago. One culture erased in life, the other erased in death. The story of the Jomon, then, is unfinished, not only because their descendants live on in fragments, but because the tombs that could complete the pictures are still closed. A people erased, a people remembered, and a people hidden, all in the same islands. History books often tell us about great empires, heroic kings, or monuments that stood the test of time. But what we've seen here is the opposite, a people who lasted longer than almost any civilization on Earth, 10,000 years, and yet were nearly erased in just a few centuries. The Jomon left no periods, no written chronicles, no dynasties, and still they left traces more enduring than many kings. Shards of pottery, a genetic signature, a silence that speaks louder than monuments. Their disappearance wasn't a dramatic conquest, it was something colder. Replacement, absorption, and forgetting. Meanwhile, the rulers who followed them, the Kofun elites, built tombs so large they can be seen from space. But their bones, their weapons, and their stories remain sealed under lock and decree. Which raises a strange question. Who is truly remembered and who is truly lost? If this story reshaped how you think about Japan's past and present, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps me keep making these deep dives into the echoes of prehistory. Share it if you think more people should know that the Jomon didn't just vanish. They live on in fragments while their successors remain hidden in silence. Until next time, keep listening to the echoes.